now let's take a few minutes to talk about the principles of art. Remember, this is how we're arranging the elements of art. It's your composition. Composition, how you arrange the elements of art. Now remember, elements, the ones we've gone over so far are just line and shape. So your composition is basically your design. So your principles are things that you need to think about when you're trying to create your design or your composition. And so far, you know, we've talked about line and shape, so that's what I'm going to use in making these examples. Okay, so the first one is balance. You need to make sure your overall design is balanced, and there are many ways you can do that. One of them is to make it symmetrical. Now, symmetrical means it's the same on both sides. So if we pretend that there is a line right down the middle, whatever you see on this side, you'll see a mirror image on the other side. So if we have a big long rectangle here, we'll have a big long rectangle right on the other side. Or let's say we had two little circles over here in this corner, mirror image on the other side. So they're exactly the same, okay, symmetrical. Then you've got asymmetrical, not the same on both sides, but it's still balanced. That's the trick. So say you have a big blob over here, and maybe to balance it off you have a lot of smaller objects on the other side. They're not the same, but it's kind of balanced. They're kind of weighted the same. Okay. Then you have what artists call the rule of thirds. So let's say I'm going to divide my paper into thirds this way and the other way, horizontally. Okay, so I've divided it each way into thirds. The rule of thirds says that where these lines intersect is where you should place your subject matter. So let me put subject here. It makes a much more pleasing arrangement to put them in these areas instead of right in the middle. That might tend to be a little boring. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example where they have divided into thirds, and notice the main subject, which is this boat, which has most of the detail in it, is placed right where that intersection is. It's a much more interesting design than just having a boat right smack dab in the middle. Or this photograph of a wolf looking out across the water. It's much more interesting to put him right here at this intersection and have, you know, all of this extra space out here instead of just having him like a bullseye right in the middle. It's more interesting. So that's the rule of thirds, is to place your subject right in one of those cross sections. The last kind of balance is radial, and that's balance that kind of works in a circle, and that would be like the classic flower where you've got the center of the flower and then the petals come out from the center. You can continue to do that. Mandala designs do the same thing where you start in the center and you branch yourself out. A wheel works the same. A spiral where you start in the center and work yourself outwards. So you've got radial designs. Moving on to pattern, what we have is a motif that gets repeated. So your motif is actually your repeated element. So what do I mean by that? Remember the elements we've been talking about. So your motif is a repeated element, so that could be repeating lines, repeating shapes, repeating color, which we haven't gotten into. So the motif is whatever is being repeated. With our pattern, what we're going to do is use a shape for our motif. So I'm just going to pick a triangle, and that element, that shape, is going to be repeated to create a pattern. So I'm just going to repeat this triangle over and over and over to create a pattern. Okay. So your pattern is the repetition of a motif, and that motif is your element, and here we're using a shape to show you how to create a pattern. And we're going to be using the pattern a lot in just this next project that we start. Okay, so then we have variety, and variety is really important. It is the use of diversity and change to create visual interest. Okay, so instead of just doing the same thing over and over and over and over, we want to spice it up a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting. So I'll take the triangle again, like we had. This time I'm going to mix it up a little bit. Some of them are going to overlap, others maybe aren't going to overlap, but maybe they're going to be bigger. Maybe I can change the way I draw my triangles, maybe make some of them longer, maybe some of them really small, maybe have one really long one to kind of help connect some of these triangles together. So when you look at this and creating a diverse group of triangles, see how much more interesting it is visually to look at than something that's just repeated over and over. Okay, then you've got emphasis or focal point. So let's say this is my piece of paper, and I have a whole bunch of squares that overlap. We're just going to make this nice and simple. Maybe some of them touch the edges. And let's say that I have decided to fill this spot in solid. Okay, this really stands out and it's different from the rest of these. So I would say this is my focal point. It's what you tend to focus on. Okay, so it's what you focus on, your emphasis or your focal point, right? And we'll talk more about that when we get into different projects. Then we've got contrast, which is basically using elements that are opposite. So let's say with shape, that could be as simple as a large shape next to a little shape. They're different, so they make each other stand out. You could have these two shapes next to each other. One you could leave white, the other one you could fill in dark. So you have the difference between light and dark. You could have a line that you can follow around, or I'm just going to lightly use some airy sketch marks here. I'm going to use my finger to kind of blend that in together. So you have this hard edge that you follow around, and then you have this shape that doesn't really even have an edge. It's just kind of blurry. They're opposite. When you have two things very different next to each other, you've got contrast. Okay, then you've got rhythm and movement, and that is arranging elements that make the eye follow a path. Okay, so that could be something like, okay, drawing these lines next to each other, and maybe they start moving up and getting really small, and then they get a little bit longer and come down. Even though these are a series of lines that don't touch, do you see how it's making a connection that kind of has your eye follow this path? Or it could be something like a heartbeat monitor, where you have the flat line and then you've got the heartbeat, and then you've got no movement, movement, no movement, movement. So there's a lot of ways to symbolize rhythm and movement through the use of lines and shapes. And then finally, when all of these things work together, you have unity. That is your ultimate goal. It's when all the elements in a composition look like they belong together. It's when your artwork looks complete. It has unity. Nothing looks out of place. Okay, so that's it as far as principles. We'll do more elements as we start different projects, but this project that we're about to start really focuses on line, shape, and pattern.